Okay, great. So on today's National Healthy Nail and Beauty Salon Alliance webinar, we have Preeti, Sharma, and Saba, Waheed, who will present on a report that they co-authored called Nail Files, a study of nail salon workers and industry in the United States. And you can read their bios on the registration page, but Preeti is a UCLA PhD candidate in gender studies and a graduate student researcher at the UCLA Labor Center. And her research interests include feminist theories of work, racialized and gendered labor, worker center organizing, women of color, feminisms, queer of color critique, and Asian American studies. Her project, The Thread Between Them, explores South Asian threading salons in Los Angeles beauty service industry and the immigrant service sector. Saba is a research director at the UCLA Labor Center. She has 15 years of research experience developing projects with a strong community participation. With her team at the Labor Center, she coordinated the first ever study of domestic work employers, launched a study of young people in the service economy, and conducted research on the taxi, garment, nail salon, construction, and restaurant industries. And we also have Lisa Fu, who is the director of the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative, and she will be giving us a summary of a recent survey done by the collab that provides a snapshot of working conditions of nearly 100 nail salon workers in the San Francisco Bay Area and Southern California. So I think we're going to start with Preeti and Saba. So if you guys want to go ahead and switch your slides, turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So today we're excited to talk about Nail Files, and this is a national study on the nail salon sector that came out in November 2018 through the UCLA Labor Center and the Collaborative. So my name is Preeti, and I'm a graduate student researcher with the UCLA Labor Center, and I've also been a longtime volunteer with the Collaborative. And my co-presenter today is Saba Waheed, the research director of the Labor Center. And just some background on the Labor Center, we support research and education to change the conditions of workers in low-wage industries. So first I'll talk about the overview of the report and two sets of findings, and then I'll turn it over to Saba to talk about the rest of the findings and the main recommendations. And this report was done in partnership with the Nail Salon Collaborative. So, given that there had been no other national studies focusing on labor in the nail salon sector, this report was really aimed at offering that key labor lens. And the point was to see what information is already out there and not necessarily gather new data. So in terms of our methodology, the report is based off of a set of existing literature, and this includes policy reports, academic studies, worker stories, and publicly available government data. We also worked with an advisory team of researchers, experts, and advocates, some of whom are on this call, and you all guided and gave feedback on the report content as well as the findings. So in terms of the report itself, it starts off with a history of the industry, and then relevant context for what makes it a venue for its current labor force and clientele. The first main section of the report looks at workers and labor issues in terms of demographics. The next main section focuses on industry in terms of nail salon establishments and sector trends. And then the third area of the report focuses on the regulations, solutions, and practices that are out there. And then it ends with recommendations. And then, lastly, we just want to say that we recognize the limitations of government data and hope that this report offers future space for further grounded research. So our first main finding is that nail salons are mom and pop. They are immigrant and refugee, and they are women. And so what we mean by this is we saw that there are nearly 7 out of 10 salons have less than 5 employees, with 9 out of 10 salons actually having less than 10 employees. So additionally, nearly 8 out of 10 salon workers are immigrants, and so when you break that out, 7 out of 10 nail salon workers are from Vietnam. And also 8 out of 10 nail salon workers are women, with a majority being in what you could call a reproductive age. And then given the population demographics, we also wanted to highlight that nearly half of nail salon workers who are not born in the U.S. do not speak English well or at all, and this has huge implications for language justice work. Interestingly, we also wanted to share that nail salon workers themselves are clustered in predominantly California, Texas, Florida, and New York. So this is for the most part some of those warm weather states, and this also has huge potential for having an impact on the industry in those spaces. And then our second main finding is that the nail salon sector is growing, but it is low wage. So we found that compared to the national rate of low wage workers in the U.S., nearly 8 out of 10 nail salon workers are low wage. So that is actually more than double the national rate. Additionally, based on census data, full-time nail salon workers make less than half the median wage for all full-time full-time workers, and then part-time workers don't actually have as much of a gap. And then the sector is largely full-time. So just lastly, in terms of the industry trends, we notice that there's a growing number of chains on a national level, like Regal Nails. Products in the nail salons are moving to call themselves natural or green, but those labels themselves are not valid. And then salons have started focusing on incorporating male clientele, whether that's through their marketing and decor. And then lastly, there's a growing number of on-demand or sort of gig economy nail salon workers. So I'm going to pass it over to Saba to do the rest.
Great. Thank you so much, Preeti. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the labor conditions within the nail salon industry. There's actually very limited existing research on workplace conditions, but there have been a couple of community organizations that have been able to do surveys directly with workers. Adhikar is one of them that interviewed Nepali workers in New York. We also have a survey of Vietnamese workers in California, which Lisa Fu will talk about after our presentation. But it does give us a glimpse into some of the the wage issues, anywhere from being paid less than minimum wage to not being paid overtime, being paid a flat rate, being paid late, or not being given breaks. In addition, when we were looking at the census data, we found that there was a really high percentage of self-employed workers. It was 30%, which was 3 times higher than the national rate. The self-employed workers is where we would find a lot of the independent contractors, and that number could be concerning, especially because it's so much bigger than the national rate. But also, is there something here around workers being misclassified? Independent contractors aren't covered by labor laws like an employee would be, so is this a way to kind of get out of some of those labor laws and protections? It could also just be to the lack of understanding of some of the differences between what makes an employee and what makes an independent contractor. There was a California Supreme Court case last year that put forward an ABC test, which would make the criteria for how one is classified a lot simpler. That could help kind of clarify, and it could have an impact on the nail salon industry. Furthermore, there's also issues of health and safety within the salons themselves, whether it's kind of issues of ventilation or health impacts, as well as repetitive injuries from the work. Also kind of just needing to revisit the regulatory standards and the oversight, which is more complicated within salons, kind of going into some of the demographics, that there's some distrust both amongst employers and workers of agencies kind of coming into their shops. And then just even within the worker and employees, kind of some of the dynamics and relationships that also make it difficult for workers to be able to speak out around some of the conditions they're seeing. We also wanted to highlight the challenges around licensing for workers, whether it's places where the curriculum is in a language that works for the worker, and the exam process being a barrier for workers, as well as how much time and the cost of the training, not having enough information, and immigration status. So those were some of the labor issues. We also kind of looked at kind of existing policies, recommendations, and so put together kind of a series of what we think things that could happen, kind of by different stakeholders to improve conditions through that kind of labor lens for workers. So the first is, we want to make sure that these salons provide quality jobs and that workers are protected in those jobs. For agencies, we want to think about, what can we do to really make sure that the wages and benefits are getting to the workers, particularly around minimum, being paid the minimum wage, the overtime, as policies advance sick leave, making sure that all of those are getting to the workers. To go deeper into this issue of misclassification. Really, if there are situations where employees are being incorrectly categorized as independent contractors and then being deprived of workplace benefits and protections, as well as the right to organize. We also want to think about policymakers as, what else do we need to kind of put forward in terms of protections and policies that will improve the job quality, whether it's, thinking about fair wages, safer workplaces, and access to benefits, removing barriers to licensing, and then also thinking about some of the challenges we experienced in trying to get government data that can fully capture the experiences and demographics of nail salon workers. For advocates, continuing to educate and work with nail salon workers around understanding, in terms of building quality jobs for employers, thinking about what could be pathways for advancing in the work and increasing their skills, and for researchers to partner up and to make sure that we're getting the data we need to understand what's happening in the workplace. Then on the other side of this is, there can be laws and policies on the books, but it won't matter unless there's enforcement. So what can we do to make sure that that enforcement happens? And so again, thinking around agencies, doing outreach to educate workers, addressing barriers to filing claims, which also includes addressing the fear that workers feel in being able to speak up, as well as be able to demand for the kind of better wages and labor rights. Thinking about creating model contracts and agreements for independent contractors, and making sure employers and workers both understand the differences between independent contractors and employees. And one that we think is also really important is to create government-community partnerships by funding community organizations who have trust with workers to be able to do some of this kind of enforcement work, or supporting it through kind of community and outreach. For advocates to continue to center workers and worker needs, and kind of build kind of the campaigns and organizing that supports workers, building multi-stakeholder collaboration, and engaging and learning from best practices from other campaigns. And for researchers, to go in and, do some of these studies that lets us understand what the work conditions are in kind of in more large scale studies, so we can see where else we need to kind of keep thinking about enforcement. So we also want to make sure that businesses that are trying and that are doing well are highlighted and are supported. So for agencies, thinking about programs that could incentivize businesses and create programs that create kind of financially, environmentally sustainable business models, educating nail salon consumers around the fair prices for the service, and then what could be ways where employers could kind of come together to share best practices. Finally, ensuring health and safety of nail salon workers, to what could be healthy nail salon practices that we can be building upon. There's some already, especially around California, so how can we expand those? Policymakers continuing to look into the issues of harmful and dangerous products, as well as, how we can ensure that healthcare nail salon workers have the healthcare they need. Advocates continuing to provide programs that kind of expand their understanding of health and safety at the workplace. For employers to think about these kind of healthy nail salon programs and being able to participate, and how they could participate and create that for their own shops. And then finally, for researchers to continue to do the research on chemicals and exposures and on kind of green alternative strategies. So that's the end for ours. There is a short link to the report if you wanted to get to it. But that's us from the UCLA Labor Center. I will pass it on to Lisa now to talk about their study.
Great. And just a reminder to folks.
Sorry, I'm going to pass it back to Jamie for introduction.
Oh, no, that's okay. I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, you could just type them into the chat box, and we'll get to those after Lisa's presentation. So Lisa, you can go ahead.
Hi. So thank you so much, Saba and Preeti, for sharing about the national report. And again, I'm Lisa. I'm with the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative. Can you change? Oh, double click. Okay, here we go. So I'm with the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative. We have been around since 2005, and we were established out of Asian Health Services, which is a community health clinic based out of Oakland, Chinatown. And we started Asian Health Services health outreach workers were actually doing outreach in the community on cancer screenings, and their Vietnamese outreach workers were going to where the community is at. And given that most nail salons are owned and run by Vietnamese in California, they were going out to nail salons to do health education, and found that the workers and owners were actually coming back to the health advocates and asking them to look into the products they were using, because they felt like some of the health issues they were experiencing were from the day-to-day exposure to the chemicals and all the various nail products that they were using for hours at a time. And so that's kind of how the collaborative was organically started. And since then, we've really grown to an organization that not only does work in the San Francisco Bay Area, Santa Clara County area, but also in LA County and Orange County in Southern California as well. And our mission is to improve the health, safety, and rights of the nail and beauty care workforce to achieve a healthier, more sustainable, and just industry. And our members, as you can see, include workers and owners, our member leaders, and also organizations. Our work sits at the intersection of various issues, including women's health, immigrant rights, Asian American health, reproductive justice, environmental justice. And so we have also organizational members that are invested in all of those issues as well. And the way that we do our work is through four main strategies, including outreach and leadership development. We do outreach on health, safety, and workers' rights issues, and we work with folks that are interested and want to really build more and develop their skills, leadership skills, public speaking skills, and for those members that really want to are invested in their industry and kind of increasing the visibility, we also provide a leadership development and leadership training letter. We also do grassroots policy advocacy, so working with our members, our worker and owner members, to advocate for various legislation and programs throughout the state and on the federal level to support programs that impact them and their daily work and lives. We also do research, community-based research, and so we partner with researchers to understand the range of issues that are impacting the industry, whether it's around chemical exposure and ventilation, to looking at prevalence of health issues that are experienced, to understanding the industry, like the previous, like how Saba and Preeti just presented. We also do research on identifying best practices for trainings, et cetera. We also, in our research, we also are intentional about utilizing and building the strength of the nail salon industry themselves so that they're engaged on a community-based level. And then lastly, we are involved with movement building work which lifts up the issues with others to support other organizations that are entering this work. It's really hard to do this outreach and organizing in the community, and so we definitely connect with other organizations across the country that are wanting to learn more. We're happy to share resources. We also connect with other organizations. Like I mentioned, this work really intersects on many different issue areas, including immigrant rights, racial justice, gender justice, et cetera, and so we connect and collaborate with other organizations working on these issues. So in terms of the research that we did, I'm going to go back a little bit. So some of you all may remember in 2015 there was a New York Times article that came out that was called The High Price of Pretty Nails, and it really was kind of like an expose on New York's nail salon industry and labor and working conditions. And that really, that report, although it did focus on New York, which was really important, it also rippled to California, because we ended up getting a lot of phone calls from media around, hey, how does this look like in California? What are the working conditions in California? How is it impacting your members, the nail salon industry in the state? And for us, the working conditions was something that had been coming up more and more with our membership, with our outreach and organizing that we had been doing, and everything that we had been hearing from our members had been anecdotal around what they had been experiencing. And so that's what we had been able to share, just kind of stories around how folks wanted to get minimum wage, but that wasn't something that they felt that they were getting, that they weren't getting breaks, but none of the stories were being documented, but the numbers weren't. And so based from that, we thought it was important for us to just really get a snapshot of what was happening across the state. And we recognized that it would have its limitations, given that it would be on a much, much smaller scale, but just something for us to start to document on a survey level in terms of qualitative level. And so we designed a survey, and it's a short survey, so it's about 16 questions that we had developed in collaboration with folks that are on our labor committee. We have a collaborative labor committee, so some of our organizational members that are working in the workers' rights industry, or workers' rights field, gave us feedback, gave us input on kind of creating a shorter survey. That's something that was doable, that we could create to collect information from workers. And some themes that were identified were included what type of work. So for example, 1099 versus W-2, what are some of the wages that they're getting, and what are some of the working conditions. And in terms of our recruitment, we recruited from the various regions that we have members in throughout the state. And so we had our members fill out the survey. We also had folks fill out the survey that we didn't have relationships with as well, so we had a range. And then some folks who fill out the survey, they had shared with us names and numbers of their friends that also work in the industry, so there was also word of mouth. And everyone who filled out the survey received a $5 gift card. And the survey was conducted in Vietnamese. And in terms of the analysis, we partnered with UCLA LOSH, so the Labor Occupation Safety and Health Program. They helped us to analyze the numbers and the information. And so here's an overview of some of the results that I wanted to highlight. And so a total of 93 workers were surveyed, and 60% of the participants identified as W-2 workers, meaning they consider themselves to be employees and not independent contractors. 58% of workers provided their own work supply. So this is one of the questions that helped us to identify really whether or not they would be considered a 1099 or W-2, because that's an independent contractor usually would be providing their own, should be providing their own supplies. And we found that 94% of the independent contractors did supply their own, and 34% of W-2 workers also supplied their own products as well. And so there was a combination. Some people didn't want to answer all of the questions, and so of those who did, these are the numbers that we came out with. Most of the 1099 workers were paid a percentage of what the customer pays, so 57%, which is pretty common. It's usually like a 60-40, and so it's like the worker gets 60% of what's paid, and the owner of the salon gets paid 40% of what the customer pays. And 40% of independent contractors said that they get paid a flat daily rate. In terms of minimum wage, in California right now, minimum wage is $11 for those who have, for businesses that have less than 25 workers. And if your business has more than 25 workers, then the minimum wage is $12. And these are employees. And so minimum wage among those who provided information on their hourly wages, 61% made actually below minimum wage for their respective cities or counties. And some made, I think the low end of the range was about $7 an hour. And again, you know, we have differences between 1099 versus W-2. So among those who were independent contractors, only 14% of those reported their wages, and 50% of them actually made below minimum wage. And then 19 out of the 28 workers who responded that were employees earned below minimum wage. And then we asked questions about various potential labor law violations. So we asked questions about whether or not we figured out whether or not folks were getting paid minimum wage. We asked about getting paid for overtime. We asked about whether an employer has been paying less than what was agreed upon. We asked about late payment. We asked if employees had ever had a check that bounced. We also asked about whether you had not been paid. And we also asked about being assigned work during your break time. And these were the top 3 potential labor law violations that we had found. And so almost 90% had not been paid overtime for work done more than 8 hours. 61% had been paid less than minimum wage, and then almost 24% had been paid late. And so when we look at the labor law violations, 77 or 83% actually experienced one or more potential labor violation. And then that we actually broke out according to region. And so we looked at Northern California and Southern California and found that actually in Southern California, 100% of those who filled out the survey actually experienced at least one labor violation. And so that was really something of a flag for us. And we learned a lot in terms of filling out, working on this survey. And really, again, it was just a snapshot. It was something we wanted to pilot, but really it was important for us to see that, number one, that we needed to do something that was a bigger survey that covered more people. It really reinforced that workers are experiencing labor violations. And when we talked about potentially doing a bigger survey in the future, we worked with UCLA Loesch to create some recommendations. And one of them that was important was to take into consideration the changing minimum wage policies that are happening across the state, across cities and counties. Like I mentioned, California had our minimum wage just in 2019 just went up. And so it's going up every year up to $15 by 2022. And so every city and county may also have their own different minimum wage. And so needing to kind of take that into consideration, it was important to include the month of the year of when the survey was completed so that we're up to date in terms of the minimum wage laws. One other thing that was important was when we were asking about how employers were paying the workers, one of the questions was around, which I mentioned earlier, was around the percentage of what a customer pays. Folks did mention, whether they were getting 60, 40 or whatnot, but we didn't ask how much are you getting per week or per month. And so regardless of how people are paid, we should ask how much they're getting paid. And then also, we know that there are a lot of really important and groundbreaking national surveys and statewide and local surveys that have been conducted. And so it would be important for any future surveys to have questions that align with other surveys that have been done. And so there's a way to really think about, to do some comparisons, with other industries. It can have broader implications if we're including nail salon workers along with some of these other big surveys. And so those were kind of some of the main highlights that we had for our local survey.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So just a reminder, if you have a question, to type it into the chat box. I think you can also raise your hand through the web technology. We did have a question, will the slides be sent to registered attendees? And yes, in the next few days I will be sending out a link to the recording of the webinar to everyone who registered. I don't see any questions besides that in the chat box at this point, but I had a few questions. One was, so clearly I feel like one of the things that was mentioned in the UCLA report was one of the recommendations was how it's important to center, or that advocates center workers' needs. And I think clearly like the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative is an organization that's doing that, but are there other organizations that come to mind that are doing that work well?
Yeah, this is Lisa. I would definitely say in New York there's some really great ally organizations that we work with. Adhikar works with Nepali nail salon workers. They organize them around workers' rights issues, among others. And Workers United is also in New York, and they also are organizing Latinx and Chinese and Korean manicurists.
Great, thanks. We had a question about, at least to you, Lisa, whether the findings of the local study have been published anywhere.
Thanks, Rena. We haven't. We felt like it was a small study, and we learned a lot from doing it in terms of just like the recruitment, and it's small. I feel like it's a good precursor for something bigger. So we have not published it anywhere. It's really more for kind of internal documentation.
And then the other question was, can your survey be shared with other jurisdictions, like Canada, for example?
Yeah, hi, and yeah, of course, we can share it. I can connect with you offline. We're happy to share it with folks.
Great. I had another question. I think if I was understanding it correctly, there was a difference in the UCLA labor study in terms of the percentage of folks who are classified as independent contractor versus what the survey that you did, the collab did. Is that right? Because it was 60%. Well, maybe it's about the same. It was 60% for your survey consider themselves employees that you surveyed. And then was it 30% of the UCLA study that folks consider themselves to be self-employed? Is that right?
Hi, yeah, this is Saba. Our study found 30% classified themselves as self-employed, and then Lisa's study had it at 40% as independent contractors. So our self-employed category, because we're using the census, is probably mostly independent contractors, although there's like a few other smaller categories that could also exist.
And then I would also add too that, you know, ours was not a random sample. We did, many of the folks who filled out our survey were our members, and that includes folks who have received training on workers' rights issues and classification, and so that may have lent to the higher number that we had.
Mm-hmm. And then we had Dorothy just wanted to point out that there's some great work being done in Toronto by the Healthy Nail Salon Network. Heather had a question. Is there any data that shows trends with like higher end salon, quote unquote higher end salons? Are there fewer wage and hour law violations, fewer health concerns, or no difference?
This is Preeti, so I can speak to some of the seemingly higher end salons that are coming into the fore. And so, you know, one of the salons, so first we looked at trends broadly through some of the industry magazines, and then just went further, you know, did a further dive into particular salons themselves. So one of them was, for example, Mini Lux, and they kind of pride themselves on trying to change the industry, for example, after the New York Times article. And so they wanted to be socially responsible in terms of the manicures and pedicures they provide, and have those hygiene standards and workplace practices that they say meet or go beyond minimum labor standards. But we found that they were definitely pricier in terms of having, you know, their manicures and pedicures at a higher cost. And they're in select kind of locations in terms of even trying to be national, and they're kind of smaller in their scale. But that was that. And then the sort of ones that are more prominent across the country, Regal Nails and Davi Nails, and, you know, we talk about this in the report, tend to be affiliated with malls and major chain retailers like Walmart. And so, you know, they're priced much lower, and there's, you know, we think higher chances for certain wage issues to be happening there.
And then also I would add to that, you know, anecdotally, we talk with workers that work in both the mom and pop and the higher end salons, and we see the violations happening in higher end salons as well. And I was just talking with a manicurist last week, and she was saying that she used to work in a nail salon in Beverly Hills, and what she was describing was like really a lot of labor violations, health and safety violations, just really over the top. And so she just said that they knew how to hide it really well. As a higher end salon, the owners would kind of direct the workers on how to act, what to use, you know, reusing single-use nail files, for example, things like that, and not using proper disinfectant, rules around proper disinfectant of tools and things like that. And so again, higher-end salons, I think, may have more resources to follow labor laws, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it.
Thanks, Lisa. I had a question. There was a stat or finding that 83%, the industry, the nail salon industry, there's 83% labor violations compared to other industries. Or do we know? Do we have data? I guess my question is, how does that compare to other industries? Do we know? Because that's really high.
Do you know which slide are you referencing?
I don't remember. I think it was your slide, Lisa. Maybe it was slide 31. I'm trying to switch it. Oh, among all 93 respondents, 83% experienced one or more potential violations of labor law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I didn't know if there's question was how that may compare with other industries.
We may have something I think we're pulling up to see in the national report.
I mean, I would say, this is Saba, we don't have other industry stats in front of us, but there was another study done a couple of years ago called Broken Laws, and we included their finding in our report, where they really looked at kind of wage violations across low-wage industries, and they had a kind of broader category of like beauty, dry cleaning, and general repair workers, and there too, there was 82% didn't get paid for overtime, and 80% didn't get meal breaks. But I think the way that, because they looked at kind of service jobs in general, like nail salon seems to fall in line with a lot of other service industries, where because labor is one of those kind of that line of the profit margin tends to have higher labor violations than kind of non-service industries. So I would say in that sense, what's happening in nail salons is probably in line with a lot of service, but nonetheless, it's pretty, it's pretty high. And Lisa had mentioned this too. Like, we definitely need bigger studies and kind of more comprehensive survey samples to really kind of get to the root of the prevalence of the issue.
Yeah, great, thanks. Are there any other questions? You can type them into the chat box. We have about 15 minutes left. I was also just going to unmute everyone because we did want to give folks the opportunity, if they're doing work on salon worker health and safety, for them just to update the rest of the folks on the call of what they've been up to. So maybe I'll just go ahead because I don't see any other questions in the chat box, and just unmute everybody. And then hopefully folks who are doing work in this area can just give us a quick update of what they're up to.
The conference has been unmuted.
Okay. Does anybody want to provide an update on the work that they're doing?
Well, hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey, how you doing? This is Lucho from Workers United out in New York City. I guess I can speak to some of the work that we're also working hand-in-hand with NICOSH, is around the licensing program, and give an update on that. We've been successfully running a licensing certification program for workers, which was, we did about a 2-hour survey with 200 to 300 workers when we initially started engaging in this process. And we asked, well, what are some of the major issues y'all are identifying in the industry, and rank them in terms of what would you like to see addressed first. And it was despite all the labor issues that existed, the health and safety, the number one issue that they wanted to address right away was the licensing, access to licensing. And so for us, that really set sort of like a pathway for us to start engaging with the community immediately. And so after, we have about 2 years now that we've been running the certification program. We are about 90, in the mid-90s in terms of pass rates for workers taking this certification program, which the Department of State has recently told us is the highest pass rate that they've seen any certification program have in the state of New York. And I think this really has to do with the effort that or the approach of the certification program. Instead of it having the classic classroom style, what NICOSH has done is created a curriculum around sort of like a popular education style of how to teach the material so that workers are able to capture the information. So even though it's a 26-hour certification program, it actually runs in the mid-30s in terms of how many hours workers are actually engaging in the learning process. From that, we have a hands-on training component where workers are actually learning the steps in order to take the practical exam, and that is a pass rate of 100%, at least on Workers United side, and I think for ADACAR, it's another high rate of passing as well. But then we noticed that there were workers being sort of having difficulty pass, both on ADACAR's end and Workers United, which had to do around literacy. So recently we were able to do a couple, we met with the workers that were having literacy issues going through the certification program, and we were able to actually get the exams to be done orally for these workers. We're in the process of seeing how that's working out before we actually consider it a victory, because I think we're also trying to look at other approaches with workers who have literacy issues within the industry. And then on the ground level, I think what we've been doing is before workers can actually get into that certification program, we run the mandatory about 10 hours to 11 hours worth of Know Your Rights trainings that workers are going through in terms of wage and hour, health and safety, immigration rights, as well as labor/union 101, which are Know Your Rights components that they have to complete before they actually can take the certification program. So, and I think now the past couple of months we've been actually doing worker-to-worker outreach in terms of workers that are engaged with us, going into the salons or meeting with workers and basically giving them the information for 2019 in terms of wages and health and safety stuff. So that's a quick update from us.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and this is Charlene from NICOSH. Just to kind of add, in terms of the literacy work, like, we were advocating with the state to try to make the program work better for limited literacy workers, and it's really not even limited. It's like people who don't have literacy for the most part, right? So they can't really read or write in any language. And so, I think that a part of this process has, just for background, is like we actually did write a report, but we kept it internal because we were seeing it as, if we needed to do more work publicly to kind of, talk about what the issues were with this population, we would do that. So we wrote an internal report that we ended up submitting to the governor's office to sort of advocate for the system to be changed, and now we're pilot testing the literacy program. So in the oral testing so far that we've done through our school, we had 4 workers take the test, and 3 of the 4 have passed, and these are workers who have already taken our 26-hour training and have failed in the past. So we've had some degree of success, but we want to get that, we want to continue to pilot test it to see how other workers do.
Great, thank you. Are there any other folks on the call? We have about 8 minutes left that you want to provide an update on the work you've been doing around salon worker health and safety?
Hi, Jamie. This is Tenny. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Tenny. Was that you, Tenny?
Yes.
Oh, yay.
For folks who don't know, I was previously at Black Women for Wellness. I'm a PhD candidate at UCLA working on salon worker health and safety. And so this past year, I've been working on developing an intervention program, particularly looking at Black salon workers and use of personal protective equipment, and really trying to understand the knowledge, safety knowledge within the population, barriers to use and adoption, held a series of focus groups with Black Women for Wellness to understand how to get people to use more personal protective equipment, letting folks know where to access that, and also piloting an intervention program looking at using glove use, face protection, eye protection, and currently just finishing that up and sort of looking at different ways to develop training programs actually developed by salon workers and able to use that training to see an increase in either personal protective equipment or various safety things in the salon. And so I'll be happy to share sort of the findings from that with the group of folks. And that's my update.
Great. Thanks, Tenny. Anybody else want to provide an update on the work or research that they've been doing?
Hi, it's Anne Rochelle Ford from the Healthy Nail Salon Network in Toronto in Canada. I can give you a very quick overview of where we're at, and I'm not sure who else from our group is on the call, so if anyone wants to add to this, please feel free to. From the continued work we were doing before, which we reported on last year in January at the convening that we all had in California, we're continuing our health-related work, moving into a new sector. We're now going into Korean salons. We had been focused primarily on Vietnamese and Chinese in Toronto, and now we're moving into Korean. And so we will be translating some of our occupational health and safety literature that we produced last year into Korean. If anyone is interested in copies of those when we have them done, they'll also be available online. We also have funding for a 2-year project that's focused more on networking and understanding of employee rights. And that is just getting going, that project, but we're working closely with an organization called the Workers' Action Center here in Toronto. We were very inspired by what we learned from the folks from New York in particular, and the work that you guys are doing and are trying to do similar work here, starting very much at the level of just networking, because there are so much it's very widespread in Toronto amongst many language groups, and so there's a lot of really preliminary work that just needs to be done at the level of people getting to know each other and finding out who's doing what. But that will be a 2-year project. And then thirdly, and I don't know if the person who's responsible for this is on the line. If she is, maybe she can pipe in. But there's also a really exciting research project being done through the Occupational Cancer Research Center at the University of Toronto. They're just concluding their work, which has actually been doing sample testing and interviewing in salons in the Greater Toronto area. It'll be the first Canadian research that is actually producing results of what they're finding in the salons. And if Victoria's on the call, if you want to add to that, please feel free to pipe in. So that's our very quick update from Toronto.
Great, thanks. We've mentioned this on previous calls, but it's worth mentioning again that in California, Women's Voices for the Earth and the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative, Black Women for Wellness, and Breast Cancer Prevention Partners was successful in passing a bill that requires ingredient disclosure of ingredients used in professional salon products to be disclosed directly on the label with the exception of fragrance ingredients. And so companies are going to have to start labeling by 2020. And so that will really give advocates more information about what chemicals are being used in professional salon products. So Women's Voices plans to do some analysis around that. And then this session in California, we're working with Black Women for Wellness and Breast Cancer Prevention Partners to pass legislation that would require disclosure of harmful ingredients in fragrance to the state of California, and in turn, those ingredients would be disclosed to the public through the California Safe Cosmetics database. So just trying to get some more disclosure of ingredients in fragrance, which we know fragrance can harbor some of the nastiest ingredients. And the reason it's not on label disclosure is because of federal preemption laws. So I'll keep folks on the listserv updated on the Nail Salon Alliance listserv updated about the progress of that bill. But is there anything else?
Yes, really quick. This is Lisa. I would just add, in addition to the fragrance bill, there's also another bill this one is one that we're co-sponsoring, AB 647 here in California, and it's an SDS bill. And so we're actually, this bill would require that manufacturers post their SDSs onto their websites, because SDSs it's another kind of right to know in terms of trying to understand what ingredients, chemicals, workers, consumers are being exposed to. And so that's something that we'll be working on this legislative cycle and working with Assemblymember Kalra's office.
Lisa, what bill number was that?
647.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate you being on the webinar, and a special thank you to our presenters. And I will be, in the next few days, I will be sending a link out to the presentations for everybody who registered. And again, if you have ideas for topics for future calls, please contact either myself, Jamie, or Lisa Fu at the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative. So thanks, everyone, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.